Our next conservation issue relates to garbage and toxicants. If you haven't heard the word toxicant, that's okay. You might be more familiar with the word toxin instead. But a toxin is produced by a life form. A toxicant is a chemical produced by humans and introduced into the environment. Garbage. We make a lot of it. People in the United States throw away about 200 million tons of garbage per day. Usually when I give this number, many students screw up their faces as they try to calculate the number of tons per person. There are about 350 million people in the United States, so this number means that each person produces between 1/2 to 1 ton of garbage per day. You might be thinking, wait, I don't throw away over 1,000 pounds of garbage each day. And that's true, you don't. But with construction, industry, and manufacturing, that waste also gets divided by the number of people. And that's a lot of waste. If we just look at plastic bottles, people in the U.S. throw away 2.5 million plastic bottles per hour. That is nuts. While that's way less than 1 plastic bottle per person per day, the number of people magnifies this to an incomprehensibly large number. We hear a lot about the importance of recycling, and it is important. Even more important, though, is to not buy things in the first place. Reduce the garbage before it's made. If you do use something, make sure you can reuse it. When we minimize our purchases, it has the added benefit of saving money too. When you've reduced your purchases and reuse everything you can, then you can recycle it. Different products have different amounts of energy savings when they're recycled. Glass is actually the easiest material to clean, melt down, and reform into a new container. It would have a slight reduction in energy savings due to the heat required for melting. However, only 30% of energy is saved when it's recycling. What happened to all that energy? It should be almost 100%. The other energy went into transportation. Glass is extremely heavy and you can't crush it to transport it. So transporting it to recycling facilities and then back to manufacturers again is so energy intensive that it has this massive impact on the energy in recycling glass. Plastic is pretty good. It's so lightweight that transportation doesn't have a big impact. Plus, you can kind of crush it so you can get more bottles into one load. But it's also more difficult to recycle plastic. Aluminum is your best bet. It's lightweight, you can crush it down to reduce space, and it recycles very easily. It's also incredibly important to recycle as much metal as you can. That's because mining metal is such an environmentally detrimental activity. Never use an aluminum can without recycling it. I also suggest downloading your community's recycling app to check which items can or cannot be recycled. You've probably seen these heart-wrenching pictures of animals that have been killed or harmed due to plastics in the environment. Even more harmful, though, are the plastics we cannot see. Plastics don't decompose. They just break down to smaller and smaller pieces. Those tiny pieces are eaten by tiny aquatic animals and end up in the food web. A little later in this mini lecture, we'll also learn about the chemicals added to plastics that disrupt reproductive functions in animals. Organic materials like orange peels or apple cores generally decompose within 6 months. They also serve an important function in the habitat, supplying energy to decomposers, which then recycle nutrients for the rest of the food web. But plastic bags and disposable diapers, not so much. Styrofoam never decomposes. Avoid it at all costs. Plastics that do not make it into a landfill will be carried away by wind or water and end up in the ocean. The oceans have these circulation patterns, and at the center are these things called gyres. There ends up being all this plastic that accumulates in the center of these gyres in every major oceanic area of the world. The North Pacific gyre and the plastic found there is the most well known. E-waste stands for electronic waste. We don't recycle electronics very well, and yet they have quite a few dangerous compounds from the plastics, or especially from the metals, like heavy metals or rare earth metals inside those devices. So e-waste is a big problem for toxicants, and we will address that a little bit further in this mini lecture. Solutions for the problem of garbage are first and foremost to reduce your purchases and select products with as little packaging as possible. Bananas are already packaged in their peels. They do not need to be individually wrapped and sold. And if you purchase a teeny tiny product, it should come in a teeny tiny package, not this horrific mess. The more you can control your purchases, the less garbage you have to deal with later on. Of the products you do buy, make sure you recycle or compost them. It's especially important to recycle metals. Now we'll look at 4 categories of toxicants. The killers are chemicals intended to kill life forms. Pesticides are intended to kill insects. Herbicides are intended to kill plants. Heavy metals include naturally occurring metals like mercury and lead, but these are released into the environment at unnaturally high levels. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that mimic endocrine hormones, like your reproductive hormones. These can cause abnormalities in the reproductive tract or function, or they can affect how an organism develops. And carcinogens are chemicals that cause a wide range of cancers and other health problems. Let's start with the killers. Around the 1940s and 50s, people were very thankful for the invention of pesticides and herbicides. In some places, like a country with high levels of malaria that's spread by mosquitoes, pesticide sprays or powders are lifesavers. People were so happy about the pesticide DDT that kids would run through the pesticide spray. Rachel Carson wrote a famous and beautifully written book called Silent Spring, which details the ecologically damaging effects of DDT. The title of the book refers to the damage DDT causes in eggshells of birds. They become so fragile that when a parent bird sits down to brood, it squishes the eggs, killing its offspring. Populations of birds, especially predatory birds like eagles, decline precipitously in this era. That brings us to bioaccumulation. Let's do a quick drawing. If we have an environment and spray a pesticide at a concentration of 1 part per million, and there are mosquitoes in this environment, they are going to absorb that pesticide at the same rate as it's found in the environment, 1 part per million. If a songbird comes along, though, and eats, let's say, 100 mosquitoes, it will end up building up that pesticide in its body. It'll now have a concentration of 100 parts per million. Or it's the same thing as 1 part per 10,000. The concentration of the pesticides builds up in this bird. Then if a, let's say, eagle or hawk comes along, and eats 100 of these little birds, it will now have 100 parts per 10,000, or 1 part per 100. So the concentration has gone from 1 part per million in the environment to 1 part per 100 concentration inside the predatory bird. This is bioaccumulation. It explains why larger predatory animals are more impacted by these pesticides. Our next toxicant category is heavy metals. These are things like mercury, lead, cadmium, and chromium-6. These often cause nervous system damage, as well as cancers, reproductive damage, and other diseases. Flint, Michigan recently experienced excessive lead in the water supply. Because it affects the nervous system, the developing brains of young children are most impacted. Eden and Goldsboro both experienced coal ash spills, which has a high amount of heavy metals, and this contaminates the water supply. The movie Erin Brockovich, starring Julia Roberts, was about a company that released the metal chromium-6 into the surrounding environment, which entered people's well water and caused a number of deaths, developmental abnormalities, and major health problems. These issues disproportionately affect poor and underrepresented communities. Not only is this an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue. If we're exposed to mercury, where does most of that mercury come from? Many people answer fish, because that's what we're warned about eating due to mercury levels. But the fish are not the origin of mercury. They take it up from the environment, and it builds up in the food web by bioaccumulation. Most mercury enters into the environment from power plants by burning coal for energy production. Endocrine disruptors are compounds that mimic endocrine hormones like testosterone and estrogen. These compounds, including phthalates and BPA, are often added to change the texture of plastics. They're also found in cosmetics, household cleaners, food packaging, even cans often use an interior plastic liner, and plastic food storage containers, and plastics in your home, car, and our classroom. PPCPs are pharmaceuticals and personal care products. Most lotions, shampoos, makeup, nail polish, perfumes, and colognes have endocrine disruptors in them. Pharmaceuticals like birth control pills are not completely absorbed by the body. A very small percentage of that medication is absorbed. The remainder, which are endocrine hormones, are excreted into the water supply. A researcher at the University of Florida in the 1990s visited Congress to warn about the threat of endocrine disruptors in our food and water. He studied alligators in a lake with a lot of chemical runoff. The male alligator's reproductive system was so poorly developed that they could no longer mate. We're seeing fish switch sexes in the water supply due to these compounds. And even human males are experiencing a shift in reproductive function. This researcher explained to Congress that, quote, Each man in this room is half the man his grandfather was, considering that sperm counts in some populations of modern males are 50% lower than they were 2 generations ago." End quote. Penis sizes are also decreasing in humans and other animals. Our last group of toxicants are the carcinogens. These are chemicals like dioxins and polychlorinated bisphenols, or PCBs. In the 1970s, a company called Ward Transformer by the RDU airport illegally dumped tons of PCBs on their property, and they secretly had it sprayed along the side of the road of 240 miles in rural communities to get rid of it. This event launched the bioethics movement because the state, in an effort to clean up the waste, created a landfill in Warren County along the Virginia border. The county was, and still is, majority African American community. Bioethics involves the social and legal issues that involve the environment and medical health. Times Beach, Missouri also experienced the illegal dumping of a carcinogen. Dioxin is an oily substance. There were many dirt roads in Times Beach, which was mostly agricultural farms and stables. It was a common practice to spray oil on a dirt road to reduce the amount of dust. But then the birds started dying, then horses and cattle. Then the people started getting sick. It was later determined that the oil sprayed on the road was actually dioxin, an incredibly potent carcinogen. The entire town had to be evacuated, and even today, no one lives there. We are currently undergoing an issue with carcinogens in the water supply here in North Carolina. You may have heard of the chemical Gen X, or PFAS, in the Cape Fear River, dumped mostly by the Chemours plant outside Fayetteville. Gen X is a chemical similar to Teflon. It's a carcinogen. NCSU researchers are currently heading up the study of physiological effects on the people in the communities near Fayetteville and Wilmington. This is not the first instance of these chemicals being dumped like this. The 2019 film Dark Waters tells the story of a lawyer who was supposed to be defending the chemical company DuPont, but his work led him to take on DuPont to defend the rural farmers in the community he grew up in. It's a really good flick. I recommend it. The solutions to these issues, first and foremost, is to avoid them. Do not buy Teflon-coated pans. Make your own homemade cleaners. Most cleaning products can be replicated with vinegar, baking soda, and some ethanol. Don't spray air fresheners. If you want fresh air, open a window. Limit your use of cosmetics or research their ingredients. Support laws that monitor levels of these chemicals, especially in our water supplies. And most importantly, learn more. Your knowledge and awareness is your defense.